Omaha. Why do you think this beach was chosen for the international ceremony today?
Thank you, Nadia. So, as discussed in that excellent summary, as you say, this is really iconic. It's engraved into the American consciousness in terms of popular media, and at the time, in terms of the headlines that came back. It is core to America's ascent to global power in its being in presenting a sacrifice of a young American life for the broader freedom of the continent of Europe. It represents many of those ideals. Yes, there's the pragmatic factor. It's in the centre of all of the commemorations, but geographically, but more than that, it has a real emotional resonance for many. And as we saw with many of those veterans talking about how lucky they are to be here now, there's a feeling of many that it could have failed, and the fact that it didn't, that this is a battle in which everything went wrong, and the courage of young Americans won the day, perhaps makes it emblematic of the significance of this day and this campaign as a whole.
Yeah, beautifully put. And let's bring in at this point Andre Adamson, and forgive me, I introduced you not quite correctly at the top of the programme. You are, of course, of the UK Royal Air Force. Forgive me, you were with them for 27 years. So, if not anymore, but nonetheless extremely impressive. Can you zoom out for us a little bit? We were just talking about Omaha Beach itself, but the whole of D-Day was a remarkable feat militarily, but also in terms of what those soldiers did, the individual cost of this battle. It was the largest amphibious operation to date in military history. So set the scene for us. Those young men are arriving. It's what, 6:30 in the morning. Did they know what they were getting themselves in for?
Thank you, Nadia. I think I'll probably take a step before then. I would think back to the preparations on the south coast of the UK, which had been going on for months previously and involved enormous numbers of soldiers mustering in various areas of an incredible logistic operation, all the ports along the south coast. And a lot of these guys didn't know where they were going. We might talk about the deception plan later on. But they weren't sure if they're going to the Pas-de-Calais or if they were going to Normandy. So there was the uncertainty around the destination. There was then, of course, and again, maybe we'll talk about this later, the uncertainty about when they were going to go, because they were originally going to go for the 5th of June. And for reasons of the weather, it was put off a day. So you have this huge apprehension, fear. A lot of the guys floating around in the landing craft getting seasick, so they're already sort of physically not in a very good shape. So then you have, when it's finally launched, you have this remarkable armada, and Ollie will have the figures for you better than me. But you have this remarkable armada crossing the English Channel. Nothing has ever been seen like it, and I suspect nothing ever will be again. To arrive on these beaches at particular times, a remarkable feat of coordination. And of course, at the heart of it are these young guys. Some of them had never left the UK. Some of them had never left the US, and here they are on this far shore in the early hours with everything going through them. But I think everybody who I've spoken to has been through it, felt they were part of something historical and significant and probably life-changing.
Yeah, something quite monumentous indeed. Thank you very much indeed. You were just seeing on our screens there a moment ago the live footage we have for you from Omaha Beach there. President Macron arriving there with his wife Brigitte, talking there with the Prime Minister Gabriel Attal. Well, let's cross then live to Omaha Beach. Claire Paquelin, our reporter, is there. Claire, tell us a little bit about who's at Omaha today. I mentioned the President, the Prime Minister, lots of other world leaders, though, attending. Give us a sense of the mood. And as I say, who's there?
Certainly, I'll give you a sense of the guest list. So as you mentioned, we have the French President Emmanuel Macron, his wife Brigitte. They will, of course, be greeting guests as they arrive. The US President Joe Biden and his wife Jill will be along shortly. Of course, we also have the Prince of Wales. We also have the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He will be here too at Omaha Beach. We also have the UK Defence Minister Grant Shapps as well as European leaders. We also have the president of the European Council, Charles Michel. So take a look at the guest list and you get an idea of the current geopolitical context that we're in. Russia, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has not been invited today. A Russian delegation, there was talk of extending an invitation to a Russian delegation. That did not happen. The Élysée Palace, the presidential palace here in France, saying the conditions have not been met in order to extend an invitation to Russia in the context, of course, of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. The battle still raging. This is a war here in Europe, the largest we've seen since the Second World War. Again, looking back, though, Vladimir Putin was at the ceremony in Normandy for the 60th anniversary of Dday and for the 70th anniversary of Dday. So certainly the world has changed significantly in the last 10 years. And just to give you an historical context as well, the Soviet Union during the Second World War paid a heavy price fighting Nazi soldiers on that Eastern Front, a heavy price in terms of losses militarily, but also of civilian life. And Stalin was at that Tehran conference in 1943 with Churchill, with Roosevelt, who, when they decided that a vast, large-scale landing was needed to open up a second front in the west of Europe. But the world is a different place now, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin has not been invited to this international ceremony at Omaha Beach today.
And Claire, look, for the past couple of weeks, you've been reporting from Normandy, hearing from veterans, but also hearing from French civilians, who many of them very young children, during D-Day. Give us a little bit of their reflections on how they view this historic anniversary today.
What's interesting is we have seen now at this 80th anniversary a new focus on what civilians went through 80 years ago today. On D-Day itself, 3,000 were killed. Many thousands more were killed in the 3-month Battle of Normandy that followed. It's a painful past here for many families. I've spoken to several civilians who lived through it. Many of them keep very strong links with veterans from the US, from Canada, from the UK, links with their children now who come over to visit them. I've spoken to Normandy people here telling me that in a way, they were desperately looking forward for this Allied invasion. They were expecting it to happen. They didn't know when, they didn't know where, but they were desperate to be freed from the control, the grip of the Nazis. But when it came here in Normandy, parts of cities like Caen and Lisieux, parts of those cities were razed to the ground, and many people lost their lives. We had families fleeing the fighting, thousands of families walking for weeks down country roads trying to get away, trying to save themselves. And that kind of memory is one that this 80th anniversary is trying to really look at straight in the eye, that there were civilian casualties too. And despite the success of D-Day, the clear military success of D-Day, and the fact that it paved the way for the defeat of the Nazis and ultimately the end of the Second World War, here in Normandy, they're very proud of their history, but there is also a painful history there because civilians clearly did suffer in the fighting too.
Claire Paquelin at Omaha Beach, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's keep showing you those live images, if we can, from the ceremony due to get underway relatively shortly at Omaha Beach, where Claire was just speaking to us from. Ketavan Gorjestani, our foreign editor, is with me here in the studio. And look, we heard this from Claire, but pick up a little bit on that, on the world leaders that are coming today and those that aren't, because the symbolism is very striking, isn't it, that we have a Ukrainian leader attending but not a Russian one.
Absolutely. And she talked about 10 years ago in 2014 when Vladimir Putin was actually attending. 2014, of course, is Crimea. And so he came to these commemorations despite what was happening in Crimea, to not to the liking of many world leaders who were actually very frustrated that he had actually been invited for these commemorations. This time around, the line was crossed, it seems, for him not to be there, and instead we have the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is going to be there, and that is also a statement from the French president, but also from all of the other Ukrainian allies to showcase sort of their solidarity with the Ukrainians. And I was listening earlier to the speeches that were given both by Emmanuel Macron and by Joe Biden at the U.S. Cemetery ceremony, and the focus was very much on learning the lessons of the past and applying them to what was happening currently in Europe, specifically mentioned by Joe Biden, Ukraine, and what is happening in Ukraine, and the need for these allies to once again come together to try to help the Ukrainians in the face of a tyranny and of a tyrant that was trying to expand. He didn't mention the word Russia specifically, but that was clearly the intended target of those comments. So I think that over the years, we've seen different sorts of geopolitical contexts play out at those D-Day commemorations. If you turn back to 2004, for example, that was the first time that Germany had been invited. So that was also, of course, very symbolic in the fact that the enemy of the past was finally invited to these commemorations. And we're going to see on that red carpet, as Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte are waiting to greet those guests, some of the countries that are involved currently in that alliance. And we're going to see some of the Eastern European leaders who are going to be arriving. So all of that, yes, it's about commemorating the past and what happened on D-Day, but it is also a major geopolitical event.
Ketaban Gorjestani, for now, thank you very much indeed for your analysis. And as we've been hearing already, D-Day was a monumental feat of organisation. It was also, though, one filled with individual acts of bravery. In this report, Claire Paquelin, who we heard from a bit earlier, has been looking at how the British forces, who had already endured 5 years of war, showed courage and flair during the Normandy landings.
John Millen's father, Bill, played Highland laddie as he came ashore at Sword Beach on D-Day. He was the personal piper to Lord Lovat, who led a brigade of British commandos.
Dad wore this kilt on D-Day and tried not to get it wet, but that didn't succeed because once he came off the landing craft he was up to his waist in water. The pipes are the pipes he played on D-Day. Every time, even now, you know, it's very emotional to actually see them.
Bill Millen was one of 156,000 Allied troops, the majority American, Canadian and British, who crossed the English Channel and landed by air and sea in Normandy on D-Day.
This is where hundreds of landing craft left to make their journey across to Normandy back in June 1944. On the 5th of June, it said that you couldn't see the sea because this was thick with landing craft. The following day, on the 6th of June, it was completely silent because they were all on their way across to France.
800 landing crafts like this one were built to carry tanks.
They travelled right up onto the beach, and then the bow door, which is at the end, would have come down, and then a tank cruise would have been able to drive them off right off onto the beach.
Lovett's speech on the 5th of June, just before they embarked, he said, in 100 years' time, your children's children will look back and say, they must have been giants. My father was a giant. I'm sorry, I do want to stop there. Every bloody time. And Lovett said, they look back and say, they must have been giants in those days.
A rather grey-looking coastline there at the end of that report, and a good moment then perhaps to talk about the weather with Dday Adamson. And look, Dday, you've already alluded to this. There was some uncertainty about which day these landings would happen, and the weather was a big part of that, wasn't it?
It was a massive part of it, and as you know, the British love to talk about the weather, but in all seriousness, this was probably the most important weather forecast in history. The Chief Royal Air Force meteorologist was Group Captain Stagg, and he was under enormous pressure at a time when the science and the technology for predicting weather was much more limited than it is today. So he's under enormous pressure from General Eisenhower and the various commanders to come up with a timing that would work not just for the ships crossing the channel, but also for the aircraft that were key to supporting the invasion.
This is the individual we're looking at here.
This is Group Captain Stagg now. The original date, as many people will know, was scheduled for the 5th of June. At the Met brief, as we call it, the meteorological brief on the 4th, Group Captain Stagg made clear to Eisenhower and the commanders that the conditions were not suitable. Heavy swell in the channel, poor visibility, which meant that the aircraft, the essential supporting aircraft, wouldn't be able to find their targets easily. And so the decision was made to defer it by 24 hours. And that was a significant decision to make because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the guys had already embarked on their ships. They were there, they were ready, they needed to be fed, they were getting seasick and so on. Over the subsequent 24 hours, Group Captain Stagg was looking very carefully at the weather charts over the Atlantic and over the Channel. They also had the advantage of having broken the German Enigma code, which meant that they were able to source some of the German weather forecasting as well. And over that time, he became increasingly confident that there was a small gap in the weather, a ridge of high pressure, which was going to be over Normandy, between starting at the end of the 5th of May and into the 6th. And so at the Met brief on the 5th, he was able to say to General Eisenhower and General Montgomery and other commanders, there is now a window of opportunity, a very short window of opportunity. And it's important because it's not just the weather. You have to line up with the tides, with the phases of the moon. And if you hadn't done it at this particular point, they might have had to defer it for 2 weeks. And as it happened, 2 weeks later, there's a terrible storm. So I know we like talking about the weather, but it was one of those perhaps unsung aspects of it which needs highlighting.
Indeed, and it did eventually take place on the 6th of June 1944. And Ollie, paint us a broad picture if you can. We talked a little bit about Omaha already, but of course that wasn't the only beach where these Allied troops were landing on that morning. Sword Beach, Juno Beach, Gold Beach, Utah Beach. Paint us a picture of what was happening there.
Absolutely. So, as discussed, the Allies were landing across 5 beaches. In the course of the day, they put ashore 156,000 soldiers. But each of these is a microcosm and a story in and of itself. For instance, at Utah Beach, the forced landing were commanded by General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., veteran himself of the Spanish-American War. He is actually buried in Omaha Beach Cemetery, which was visited by world leaders earlier today, alongside his younger brother, who had died in the First World War. A fascinating microcosm of human sacrifice in 2 world wars. You have Omaha Beach, as we've discussed already, and next to it gold, the linchpin, the centre point, landed on by British troops, scene of the only Victoria Cross won that day by Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis of the Green Howards from Yorkshire. To further east, Juno Beach, landed on by the Canadians, and the most successful of those operations that day. And finally, Sword, the British landing closest to the River Orne, vital position, landed on by paratroopers, and also the site where Commandant Kieffer, commanding 177 French commandos, went ashore that day. So, an array of stories that we can certainly delve into given time.
Yeah, and I think we will do that. Let's look a little bit at one particular story. As we've been hearing, Omaha Beach is where many of the Americans arrived on June the 6th. And this next report is of an American veteran who has made it to these commemorations here in France. His name is Irving Locker. He's soon to be 100 years old. And our correspondent Fanny Allard met him in Florida before he made the journey.
Irving Locker was one of the 73,000 American soldiers who landed in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 to liberate Europe and the world from the Nazis.
There were 5 beaches: Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno, and Sword. The Americans were on Omaha and Utah. And I landed here in Utah Beach. And then we traveled all the way through here.
At 99, he has the energy of a much younger man, and the memory too.
This came up off a wall of Berlin.
A flag taken from the enemy that Irving made his men sign to remind him. He now lives with his wife in a Florida retirement home, where he keeps his war trophies.
These are old daggers that I took away from pilots and Germans. The swastikas are still on them. It's a German Luger from 1916. When we shot the plane down, the handles broke. The pilot was dead. So I had the Germans make me handles with my name on it to make sure they wouldn't steal it from me.
Irving was 18 when he was called up and posted to the 116th Anti-Aircraft Battalion. In October 1943, he set sail for England on the Queen Elizabeth. 8 months later, Operation Overlord was launched.
The invasion had been scheduled for June 5th, but bad weather in the Channel had caused a postponement.
D-Day was a tremendous day because the seas were very rough. We came in on the LSTs, and then we transferred to the Higgins boat. But we were pretty sick. Very few of us were taking cruises and get used to that. But coming in, it was just a very, very rough situation. We were just scared. And the long life you thought you could have could be ended. We had a 27-pound pack on the back of everything we owned. We had that big, heavy shovel we carried, a rifle, and they're shooting at you, and you're doing this, and you jump into that water. I'm 5'1", so coming off the Higgins boat, jumping into 5 feet of water, I'm very lucky to be alive, you know, with that. So.
After the landings, Irving and his battalion moved steadily eastwards, always setting up camp in open country.
The barrel of the gun was 15 feet long, so we couldn't be near a city or near civilians to that point. So we had to be in a field, and that's what, like I said, it would be my job. Once we got the guns settled and we got a march order to move the guns, I would have to go to the new field, whether it's 5 miles, 10 miles, who knows, 20 miles, wherever they designated. And every gun was connected to the radar by cables. So it had to be within a certain thing, but they connected because the radar controlled 4 guns. They could tell us the height of the plane, the speed of the plane, how far we'd have to shoot.
Upon their arrival in Germany, Irving and his men liberated the Gardelegen labor camp and saw for themselves the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis. A traumatic memory for the Jewish veteran.
We heard about camps. We didn't believe it. To that point, we never saw it. And of course, when I got there, it was the worst thing in the world. Now, what we understand at Gardelegen, they were afraid that the people, the prisoners, would identify the guards or the people in charge. So they took a barn. There was a barn there. They put hay and straw and gasoline in there, put 1,000 people into that barn and burned it. And they tried to get out. If you try to get out, they machine gun you. If I lived there, it could have happened to me. When I went to the camps, it could have happened to me, what they did to the Jewish people.
At almost 100, Irving continues to give lectures and tell stories of the war to remind future generations of the price of freedom.
People have to know what it is and what it was in order to appreciate what the men did for them, and the women, men and women both, what they did to make sure they're free and live the way they do.
The remarkable story there of Irving Locker, nearly 100. We're still waiting for the world leaders to finish arriving for this international ceremony taking place today at Omaha on Omaha Beach. And let's perhaps talk about some of the military generals who led men like Irving Locker on the battlefield. Andre Adamson, if I can come to you. Two of the big names that spring to mind, Eisenhower, Montgomery. Tell us a bit about them, perhaps the qualities that they had and how it was that they managed to, lead this group into war.
Absolutely. Well, as many will understand, the key importance of a success in a military operation is leadership.
I'm going to cut you off just for 1 second. Do forgive me. We're just seeing an important modern moment. Volodymyr Zelensky there arriving with Emmanuel Macron on the red carpet. Volodymyr Zelensky there arriving at this ceremony, that testament to the fact that Ukraine, of course, at war now, the biggest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War being commemorated today. Quite a moment there, Zelensky arriving in his trademark fatigues. Vladimir Putin, as we've discussed, not attending the ceremony this year. Well, if you'll forgive me for that, Andre, let's perhaps pick up where we were a few moments ago. You were telling us a bit about Eisenhower and Montgomery, some of the key commanders at Dday.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, the timing of that was perfect to see President Zelensky with the leadership he's had to show over the last two and a bit years in this tragic situation in Ukraine. But yes, going back to the point, the leadership is key to a success in any military operation. And the Allies were had the decision to make about how Overlord would be run, who would be the supreme commander, who would command the air, who would command the land, who would command the naval forces. And
is that who we're looking at in the pictures
so
here?
That is General Eisenhower. I believe there is a short piece that we could perhaps run before we talk a little bit about the supreme commander himself.
Indeed, let's listen to Eisenhower.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
Eisenhower there speaking to the troops, Andre, and as you were saying, that sort of speaks to some of the qualities that he had as a commander.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so Eisenhower has an interesting background and biography. He's a 54-year-old general from the Midwest, from Kansas. He had been promoted quite rapidly. It only took him 3 years to get from colonel to general. And he had virtually never heard a shot fired in anger ahead of Overlord. And I think he was quite sensitive to that as an individual, and compared with some of the hardened combat veterans that he was having to work with. But he had some unique qualities which made him perfectly suited as Supreme Allied Commander. Mainly, I would say, a sort of a generosity of spirit. He was able to forge alliances between individuals. He was able to be conciliatory. He was able to manage the undoubtedly large egos of some of the other commanders, and also having the political skills to actually pull together both the military and political requirements of an operation of this size when you're working in coalition. So I think his greatness as a commander is not so much necessarily as a battlefield commander, but as someone who is able to create and sustain that alliances in the face of the pressures that he was under. And it's also worth knowing that he, in his pocket, he carried a letter which he'd written to the President of the United States, which, in the case of failure of Overlord and actually the Allies being pushed back into the ocean, he would have submitted to the President and to Churchill, saying, "I take full responsibility for this," and he carried that around with him. So this, from his perspective, he wasn't overconfident, and he realised what a difficult operation it was. But he was certainly the ideal man as Supreme Allied Commander, and of course he went on to be US President subsequently.
Ollie, anything to pick up on there in terms of the military leadership?
Well, Eisenhower, fascinatingly a general, but pushed to political leadership almost. His focus was the up and out, where the commander of the force in Europe, General Bernard Montgomery, was very much the opposite. We talked earlier about British dash and panache, as exemplified by Lord Lovat and his Piper. This is another fine example, a soldier's soldier. He was beloved of his soldiers and detested by his superiors. A deeply abrasive personality, some would say, but equally one who was exactly what was needed. He knew how to command troops, how to lead them both in battle. He had experience from the First World War, but also how to lead them from the command center. And so he's instrumental for the Allies in bringing this operation to fruition after 2 years of planning, and once on the continent, leading troops forward. In all walks of life, you need different forms of leadership. Eisenhower, perhaps that commanding CEO. Montgomery, much more down in the dirt, COO, getting things done, not quite minding who he annoys.
Well, let's just show you those live images briefly now. Prince William arriving there, if we can show you those pictures, greeted there by Emmanuel Macron on the red carpet at Omaha.
And we're seeing now some of the major countries of this alliance that are being represented. This, of course, the Prince of Wales. We saw Charles Michel, the President of the European Council. Of course, we stopped for the arrival of the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky. There was also the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, back during the Dday landings. The enemy, Germany, now part of that transatlantic alliance. And there was also the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. So really a selection of those members of that alliance that all of those leaders have been talking about for the past 24 hours in their speeches. The strength of the alliance, the strength of the United States coming together with the Europeans and building what would become NATO, and the importance of NATO these days, of course, with the symbolism of having Volodymyr Zelensky, while his country is at war, coming here and being greeted by the French president and meeting later with some of the leaders of the world. He's expected to meet, for example, with Joe Biden after the ceremony. So it is pretty symbolic to see all of them walking in one by one.
Yeah, indeed. A modern alliance we're seeing playing out on our screens there. Katavan Gordestani for now. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go back 80 years, gentlemen, if we can, to D-Day itself, and particularly, well, actually not D-Day, the years ahead of D-Day, because it was a long time in the planning. And Andre, one of the most interesting things about it, to me at least, was the deception plans that the Allies put in place so that the Germans didn't know what was coming. Tell us a bit about that.
So the Allies had decided that they would put in place 2 deception plans. Rommel had intended to have his Atlantic wall complete, to run really from the borders of Scandinavia right down to the Spanish border. That Atlantic wall wasn't complete. Therefore, he would have to make a decision as to where to station the forces for maximum effect in the case of an invasion. The Allies knew that very well, so they put in place two deception plans. One to invade Europe through Norway, and the other one to invade Europe through the Pas-de-Calais, as the shortest distance, of course, for a naval armada to run.
Indeed, and didn't the Germans suspect that potentially it could have happened through Pas-de-Calais?
Very much so. And that's the operation, which is called Fortitude, was it designed to do exactly that. The preparations were really quite elaborate, and it was very sophisticated. So they set up a pretend headquarters in Edinburgh Castle. They set up an army group complete with tents and blow-up tanks and pretend camps, and even smoke coming out of the pretend barracks, to give the Germans the impression that they will be coming across the channel at the Pas-de-Calais. And the result of that was a direct military effect, which meant that Rommel, until the very, very last moment, did not know if the Allies were coming across at the shortest bit or at Normandy, which meant that he had to spread his forces in such a way that gave a considerable advantage to the Allies.
Fascinating. Ollie, anything to pick up on from what we just heard?
Nothing at this point. So I think what's again key, we look at personalities. Another individual famous from the conflict, General George Patton of the US military. What really helped to sell the idea of First US Army Group, that invasion of the Pas-de-Calais, is putting America's most famous, most popular, most out there general in command of this army group. Because, of course, why would the great victor of the desert be put in charge of what was anything other than the main effort? And so for the Germans, that becomes the focus. The German intelligence assessments from March 1944 suggest that the landings would come somewhere between Calais and the Loire Valley. So a vast stretch of coastline that suddenly becomes on the table and really problematic for the Germans. They hit a point of decision overload where they're just unable to respond. And then the Allies, who've been looking at Normandy all along, are able to plan and execute at their leisure.
Ollie Marks, for now, thanks very much indeed. Let's see if we can cross back now to that ceremony at Omaha. Claire Paquelin, our reporter, with us. Well, I hope she's with us. Claire, I see her. There she is, Claire Paquelin. Claire, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the French, the Free French, because this ceremony today is honouring international allies of France, but I understand here in the country it's important to remember that French people played their role too.
Certainly here inside France, the French resistance, but also outside France, the Free French Forces. I had the honour of meeting a gentleman who's 100 years old, Jean Caillé. He was part of the Groupe Lourd, so he was one of the French airmen who was actually living for 3 years in Yorkshire on an airbase there, and he was integrated along with hundreds of others. More than 2,000 French airmen were integrated into the Royal Air Force, and they flew on Dday. They bombed the area near where I am right now, around Omaha Beach, and their story is not all that well known here in France. The Groupe Lourd are a little bit of the Dday story. Their families, as well as the two veterans who are still alive, Jean Caillé and another gentleman, they feel that their story hasn't really been told. You also, of course, have the French resistance, who were very involved in giving crucial intelligence to the Allies. The Allies had reconnaissance photos which were taken by planes, so they knew what was happening on the land in Normandy. They were able to take these photos with these reconnaissance aircraft, but they also had intelligence coming from resistance members here in Normandy and other parts of France, and that was crucial for their planning. They knew where some of the Germans were, they knew which important bridges were, they knew what was happening thanks to those French resistance members. And we saw Emmanuel Macron yesterday in Brittany honouring some French resistance fighters in the Morbihan who lost their lives. Many lost their lives in June 1944, trying to hold back the German counterattack. So yes, the role played by French resistance fighters as well as the Free French outside France is one that, as this 80-year anniversary comes around here in France, people are looking at that and focusing on that too.
Claire Paquelin, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. And Ollie Marks, would you like to pick up on a little bit of that, the role that one particular French commander played in the Free French forces?
Yes, indeed. So another important story of the French contribution on D-Day was the landing of 177 French commandos on Sword Beach at Ouistreham, right on the eastern flank of the Allied landings. A really significant contribution. These troops are not just the only French forces who landed on the beaches, and thus in that striking a real blow, a real victory for the French. And that's him on your screens now. But more importantly, and really in a battle-winning effect, they were responsible for securing the town's casino, turned into a strong point by German troops. Kiefer himself riding a tank into position to destroy that defensive location. And so, even though it's only a very small number of people, they directly translate to unlocking that beach, getting troops off it into the French countryside and really starting the liberation of their own country.
Ollie Marks, thank you very much indeed. And we did hear from Claire Paquelin, who is at that ceremony in Omaha. It looks to me like the ceremony may well be getting underway right now. These are live images we're showing you from Omaha Beach, the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Some of the few surviving veterans arriving there. And gentlemen, it's so powerful, isn't it, to hear this music and see these men who are approaching 100, many of them. Some of them have come all the way across the Atlantic from the United States to be here for this tribute today.
Absolutely. It's really significant. We've heard a lot about how this is potentially the last commemoration at which we'll have veterans. The last of Commando Kiefer, Léon Gauthier, sadly passed away last July. And what's really significant for myself at least is this is an event that is very much about to pass out a living memory. 80 years, more than 3 generations, for many a healthy human lifetime. And so the reason we have to take a really clear-eyed look at these events and prevent them transitioning from history to mythology is to ensure that this remains in our consciousness long after perhaps those who can tell their own stories have left us.
Andre, you're nodding there. Anything to pick up on as we look at these images of the veterans arriving there?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with Ollie. And passing this baton on to a new generation, I think we can say that these last 30, 40, 50 years have been generally of peace and prosperity and profiting, if you like, from the sacrifice that was made in 1944 by so many. And it is important for this new generation to pick up that baton and realise that, if you like, freedom isn't free, that there's a price to be paid, and that perhaps it'll be interesting to see how these are commemorated in 5 and 10 years' time when we don't have the veterans with us. But that legacy, as Ollie's saying, for it to become history rather than mythology, not something that can be invoked almost like an afterthought, but something where we use as a reference point for our own, the way we see our security and our defence in the future.
Absolutely, and Ketavan, it will be interesting, won't it, to hear whether President Macron, when he speaks later on during this ceremony, whether he makes that connection between our history, between what happened 80 years ago and between modern Europe today.
Absolutely, and he sort of started doing that in some of the speeches that he's done over the past 24 hours, because he gave several speeches yesterday. He spoke earlier today at the U.S. cemetery, and this idea of the U.S. Coming to the aid of Europe, of course, is going to be a theme, but more broadly, the fact that the Allies came to the help of Europe at the time is something that is, of course, resonating very much in all of the speeches that we've been hearing, because that is really what they want to focus on, they want to transmit. And I think he said a line to the effect of, we must remember all of the sacrifices so that we don't take it for granted. We don't take what we have today for granted. And of course, the war in Ukraine is bringing this memory very much to the forefront. This idea of transmitting that memory, earlier we were on set during that U.S. ceremony, and we had a report where one of the veterans who is actually there, who through his grandchildren and great-grandchildren actually started a social media page and has about 800,000 people following him. I think his name is Papa Jake, and he is transmitting the memories that he has from that time to the new generation. I think what you were saying about the fact that, you know, we're slowly losing these veterans, and we no longer have the direct, somebody in my family is there to tell the story. We are now having to rely on what is left, these ceremonies, the transmission of those stories, and maybe in 10 years we'll still have those images of those veterans who might be gone by then, and keep that memory alive. And just to finish on a note, I was just looking at my Facebook memories from 10 years ago, and I was actually covering the 70th commemorations, and I met a British veteran who was called Cyril Banks that day, and I spoke to him, and he told me about his memories and what it meant to be there, to be able to participate. And I think he had said something, I will be coming as long as I can. And I just looked up earlier online to see if he was still around or not, and he passed away 2 years ago. So that memory is slowly fading away, but these are the men who helped carry it through their testimonies, even when they're gone.
And that's why we have ceremonies like this today. I think this is something that France puts a good deal of emphasis on. We're still waiting, it's worth saying, for the US President Joe Biden to arrive. We haven't seen him on our screens. We assume he's still on his way. The ceremony won't get fully underway until he arrives. So we'll stay with these images for now. Andre, or indeed Ollie, if either of you want to pick up on a little bit of that, think about perhaps what you think the lessons are from 80 years ago to today in terms of leadership, in terms of a Western alliance. What jumps out for you?
I think that idea of alliances is absolutely integral to everything we're looking at here. This was in no way a unilateral action. Everything was alliance-based. And even something Ketavan said about going 10 years ago. So I was in Normandy at Utah Beach 5 years ago for the 75th anniversary. Along the way, I made a stop off at the Danish Memorial because 800 Danish sailors helped land American troops on Utah Beach. And likewise, Frederick X, the King of Denmark, is in attendance today. And really, all of the heads of state visiting exemplify those leaders or the nations that participated. For instance, it's quite poignant, the naval procession that will be occurring later this afternoon includes a Norwegian ship. One of only 3 ships sunk on Dday was the Norwegian ship Svena, a free vessel that had left the country in 1940. Its crew subsequently, on the morning of the 6th of June, sailed their vessel into the path of torpedoes headed for a British vessel. Truly a sacrifice for people who were not fighting for their own nation, but for the betterment of Europe, for the values that they upheld, and freedom from tyranny.
Thank you very much, Ollie Marks, for us there. You're listening to the French Army Choir as we wait for this ceremony to get formally underway at Omaha Beach. And let's see if we can cross back there, speak to Claire Paquelin. Claire, if you're with us, look, we've been speaking a little bit here about veterans and about the role that they've played. I know over the past few weeks when you've been reporting this story, you've spoken to plenty of veterans yourself. I'm interested in what they've said to you about how they feel. Oh, she can't hear us, I'm being told. Well, she's back. Claire.
Speaking to veterans is a very...
Go
Can
ahead,
you hear me,
Claire. We
Nadia?
hear you very well. Please go ahead.
Speaking to veterans is a fascinating experience, but also speaking to their children. I've spoken to the children of veterans who now feel that it's their job, their role, to continue the stories of their fathers. I spoke to Penny Howard Bates, who's the daughter of Major John Howard, who of course commanded that very brave, very risky British operation at Pegasus Bridge, as it's now known, as well as Ronville Bridge, as two bridges, very, very important, crucial really. These British men arriving in gliders, these wooden aircraft arriving in the dead of night between the 5th and 6th of June, led by Major John Howard and his daughter. He died now several years ago, but his daughter Penny has inherited all of his archives. She showed me some of his archives. Fascinating, top secret. They're written on the May 1944 reconnaissance photos that she showed me as well. She's got all of that, and she now feels that she needs to pass down the history. She's 80 herself. She was born just a few months before her father, the Major John Howard, was part of the D-Day operation, and now her daughter, it's up to her daughter now. She will one day inherit those archives as well. So it really is a family affair, and you see that with lots of families of veterans here. They are doing their best to try to pass down the history to their children, to young people. Of course, it's not an easy task as we move from this living history to one that's purely historical, as we are now losing the remaining veterans that are still here today.
Bacala at Omaha, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've been talking all this afternoon about the brave men who sacrificed their lives to liberate France from Nazi rule, but women played their role too, didn't they, Andre? And I know you wanted to talk to us about two women in particular.
Yeah, thank you. So we did a bit of research within my family, actually, into these two ladies. During the Battle of Normandy, and we might talk later on about the fact we're talking here about D-Day, but of course the Battle of Normandy went on really until August. And although the celebration really, or the commemoration, is around today's events, there's the battles, the subsequent battle went on until mid-August. And clearly, as the casualties mounted, the requirement for the medical health services became greater and greater, and there were field hospitals. There were a great deal of medical personnel on hand to look after the troops. What they would do would bring them back to a hospital in the UK. So they put them onto a hospital ship, and they bring back them treatments in hospitals in Portsmouth or Southampton. These two ladies, the one on the left is Sister Dorothy Field, and the one on the right, Sister Molly Evershed. They were nurses that were in their late 20s, early 30s, sent out to Normandy to look after the wounded. In August, they were on a ship, the SS Amsterdam, which actually used to be a ferry between Harwich and the Hook of Holland. So it had the ferry, the ship itself had a lot of sailors from that part of the UK, and it was fitted out as a hospital ship. On the third run of that day, so they were shuttling between Normandy and the UK. The ship was at anchor off of Caen and hit a mine. Everybody evacuated as the ship began to sink, because the mine hit it towards the back of the ship, towards the rear of the ship and the engine room, and the ship began to sink very quickly. Everyone got off the ship, including these two brave ladies, and then they realised that a lot of the patients weren't physically able enough to get off the ship, so they went back onto the ship. And in acting incredible bravery, they rescued 76 wounded soldiers, but unfortunately, on the last group that they got off the ship, they weren't able to get off in time, so they went down with the ship and died. So, of the 22,000 who were killed during the Battle of Normandy on the UK side, these are the only two women. And they have their names inscribed in the memorial to the missing at Bayeux Cemetery, and the only 2 women there. So I think it's an interesting story. They also, I read yesterday that in the Standing with Giants memorial that they have at the British Cemetery now, or the British Memorial now, these two ladies are commemorated as well. So it's good that we brought that to greater attention.
Yeah, absolutely an important story. Thank you very much indeed, Andre. We're still waiting for formal proceedings to get underway at Omaha Beach. I believe, yes, that's right, the Italian leader, Sergio Mattarella, there, the president, just arriving for the event. And Ketavan, look, we have said this before, that President Vladimir Putin of Russia isn't going to be there, but that doesn't mean that the efforts by what were then Soviet soldiers during the Second World War has been forgotten, does it?
No, and the Elysee was very intent on making that distinction clear when they briefed us reporters on the commemorations and who would be there and what were the meanings of the different ceremonies. And so while they said that the conditions weren't met for the presence of Vladimir Putin, they did say that they were going to honor what they called, quote, the decisive contribution made by the Red Army during World War II, and how without them, maybe some parts would not have been possible, and that other front, that Eastern Front, was actually crucial in the victory in the end of the Allies. But they said that they wanted to make a real distinction between the Red Army at the time and their involvement in fighting the Nazis, and the Russia of today, led by Vladimir Putin, that invaded Ukraine. So they really insisted that throughout these commemorations, so we'll see if President Macron mentions those sacrifices from the Red Army, or whether he alludes to that without speaking directly for the Russians. But at least the Elysee said that the message was, we do not forget any of the sacrifices made, even from the Red Army, because they make that very clear distinction that the Russia of today is not the Russia or the Soviet Union of yesterday, especially when it comes to World War II.
Ketavan Gordestani for now. Thank you very much indeed. Ollie Marks, I wanted to talk to you about a different aspect of 1944, and that's the French civilians who were living in Normandy. This is a day primarily to honour those who fought, those who were in the military, but French civilians living under Nazi occupation suffered a lot as well, and it's not a story we perhaps hear about in the same way, is it?
No, indeed. It's always a difficult part of the story to discuss, in part because of, in many ways, the tragic aspects of it. France has been under German occupation for 4 years by this point. Mm-hmm. In some parts, very quiet, live and let live attitude. In others, scenes of deep brutality executed by some parts of the military. And even after the liberation began, while the French population were understandably overjoyed to see this, at least within Normandy, there are huge losses taken, be it in destruction of farmland and death of cattle, livestock, horses and so on, from artillery, from aircraft of both sides, but also human loss of life and of livelihood. The city of Caen, initially intended as the first day objective of British forces, in the event suffered 80 days of near continuous bombardment, of suffering, and eventually of battle between the two sides before eventually it is liberated in August.
Ollie Marks, thank you very much indeed. Now, as we have been hearing, the majority of the Allied troops at Dday were Americans, Canadians and Brits, but there were a small number of French, part of the Free French Forces, and an even smaller number of them are still alive today. Claire Paquelin brings us their story.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous nous rassemblons aujourd'hui pour honorer la mémoire de héros méconnus.
Christian Pélissier was only 4 when his father, a lieutenant in the Free French Air Forces based in England, was killed in 1944. Yvonne Final also grew up without her father. He too was killed as he returned from a combat mission. Christian and Yvon are part of the Association of the Groupe Lourd, French heavy bomber squadrons who were integrated into the Royal Air Force. 80 years ago, they bombed a German battery in the town as part of the D-Day operations.
Our wish is to make this part of history better understood. It's a sad story that is not well known. We hear, of course, about D-Day, about the Allies. But we don't hear about the French airmen. They're not well known at all.
Their story starts in 1943, when the French airmen based in North Africa were integrated into the Royal Air Force. Jean Caillé was 20 in 1943 when he answered General de Gaulle's call to resist the Nazis.
I left France to go to Spain, crossing the Spanish border, because I wanted to escape everything that could have happened to me and join the fighting forces in North Africa.
After finally making it to Morocco, he found out that a group from the Free French Air Forces was about to leave Algeria for England. He asked to join them.
I was very happy during the war when I was in England, doing my job, and everything was okay, unless I was without news from my family.
Almost forgotten now, the Groupe Lourd paid a heavy price during the Second World War. 216 men were killed, a third of those who flew in the aircraft. In Grand Comb-Mézy, their names are inscribed at the War Memorial dedicated to their memory.
And Claire Pacala with that report for us. Well, as we were talking about the Air Force in that report, it seems like a good moment to bring in our Air Force expert of the Royal Air Force himself, Dday Adamson. On D-Day, we of course talk about the soldiers who were there on the beaches, but what kind of role did the Air Force play?
So the Air Force clearly was critical both in the preparation ahead of the invasion itself, hitting strategic targets, railways, factories, and on the day itself, providing what we would call air supremacy. And what that means is that there was no serious counterattack from the German Air Force, that they were effectively grounded. They only generated about 400 flights, sorties, as we call them. And that was enormously significant because at every level, air power gives you the advantage. It gives you the advantage of identifying where your enemy is. It allows you to attack your enemy in areas where he's vulnerable. And particularly when the Armada was coming over the Channel, there was serious concern that the German Air Force were going to be able to intercept substantial amounts of forces. In the end, that didn't happen. The Allies had a staggering amount of over 11,000 aircraft. 11,000 aircraft operating that day from bases across the UK of all types. Fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, where they were towing gliders, where they were carrying paratroopers, where they were carrying out strategic missions behind the lines. An incredible feat of coordination between the air commanders and the guys on the ground and the naval forces as well. It is probably worth picking up on the piece that we just saw, the lengths to which some soldiers, airmen, took to get into the war, and we were seeing there the testimony of the Free French aviator who came up through Morocco to join back into the war. People really did want to get into the fight. People who believed in it would go to extraordinary lengths to do that. And we didn't talk. The President Dday was there before, and it is perhaps worth at this point talking about a little bit about the role of the Poles, and we might come back to it later, because this was a country that had been invaded both from the east and the west at the beginning of the war. Huge numbers of Poles have been sent into exile in Siberia, my own father, as it happens. And when Germany then invaded Russia subsequently, they all wanted to come back into the fight. and joined the Allies. 150,000, 200,000 Poles did just that, both in the Air Force and on D-Day, significantly. There was an armoured division under General Maczek who performed heroically, and we might talk a little bit later on about their role in the final end game of the Normandy battlefield or the Normandy battle. But it's worth, I think, just picking up the general point that very brave individuals from all over Europe and beyond wanted to come into the fight on the Allied side, often at great individual cost.
You know, the Polish contribution is really multifaceted, be it on the intelligence side. So the initial work to crack the Enigma device had started in Poland pre-war, before that work was then handed over to Britain. Or be it the Free Polish Navy, which, for instance, participated in the sinking of the battleship Scharnhorst. And equally, that French contribution that we discussed earlier is multifaceted. Andre picked up on the interesting point of the preparation for the landings, and that is just as ably contributed to by the French resistance, not just Free French, not necessarily civilian, but those who were willing to put themselves and their families at risk for those principles that they believed in, be that at one end perhaps with providing maps, personal photographs, or be it in conducting sabotage.
Ollie Marks, thanks very much indeed. If you're just joining us here on France 24, a reminder that we're looking at live events there from D-Day. This is the 80th anniversary, a ceremony on Omaha Beach. The US President Joe Biden there just arriving for the start of the ceremony. Ketavan Gorjestani, quite a moment, isn't it? US presidents, for them, this is an important event, and arguably, particularly for Joe Biden this year, given that it's an election year and Biden may well want to say, look, I'm rather different from the other candidate facing you, because Donald Trump has a rather inward-looking America First vision in his language. Biden wants to say, my vision is more outward-looking.
Absolutely, and he started the day, of course, with that ceremony at the U.S. cemetery with Emmanuel Macron. And in his speech, there was a message, of course, to Russia and Vladimir Putin when it comes to Ukraine and the alliance. But there was also a very subtle message to Donald Trump and Donald Trump's supporters, especially when he talked about the importance of alliances, because, as you said, Donald Trump has multiple times questioned the importance, the necessity, the role of America in those alliances. And Joe Biden said something in that speech earlier, saying alliances make us stronger, saying that that's something that he hopes that Americans can remember. And of course, this whole sequence of events, whether it's the commemorations, his speech tomorrow at the Pointe du Hoc, similar to that of Ronald Reagan 40 years ago, which was also during a re-election year, and then on Saturday, the state visit in Paris with Emmanuel Macron, all of those moments are going to allow him to show his difference, to insist on his messaging of democracies versus autocracies, of the world at an inflection point. These are sentences that we've heard over and over again from Joe Biden, and these moments, these images are also a very symbolic way and very good for his campaign, because yes, Americans, most of them don't vote with foreign policy as a priority, but these moments show a world leader, show America being one of the main players on the world stage, and that plays into Joe Biden's message that America, yes, is strong, but America is stronger when they are with their allies, especially their European allies. And he talked about that, and the White House insisted on that, saying this is American leadership, but it's not an arrogant leadership. It is a humble leadership that recognizes that without our allies, we cannot do what we did, for example, during World War II. And so these images of all those leaders together, and of course the fact that Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron are arriving the last together, is symbolic of that.
Yeah, we see Mark Rutte there as well, Volodymyr Zelensky there hugging Jill Biden, I believe. European leaders, American leaders there for the start of this ceremony at Omaha Beach to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Running slightly behind schedule, but the world leaders have now arrived, so we expect things to get underway relatively shortly. Go ahead, Ollie.
You know, it's interesting that we talk something that Biden spoke about in his own speech, where he discussed there being that inflection point between isolationism and globalism. This is the same battle that was being fought in American politics in 1936 when FDR was seeking election. America often grapples with being an Atlanticist, a Pacific, a America's only power. And so perhaps what we're seeing here is a signal. 80 years ago, a choice was made. Is perhaps Biden trying to indicate that the same choice should persist?
A great question, Ketevan.
Yeah, and I think that we are seeing also the fact that he mentioned that isolationism, and he had a sentence that was almost to the word similar to one that was pronounced by Ronald Reagan 40 years ago at the Pointe du Hoc. At the time, Ronald Reagan had said, "We learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments." And Joe Biden earlier today saying isolationism was not the answer 80 years ago. It is not the answer today. It's very similar messages and words.
Ketevan Gurjestani, thank you very much. Looks to me like the film projection, which is supposed to open this ceremony, is getting underway, I believe, or indeed perhaps not.
I think
it looks like it is. Let's see how much of this film we're able to follow from here.
Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne blessent mon cœur d'une longueur monotone.
Initialement fixée au 1er juin 1944, la date de l'assaut fut sur décision.
All right, that ceremony just starting there at Omaha Beach. Claire Paquelin, our reporter on the scene, she's there at Omaha. Claire, tell us a little bit about what's happening today.
Let me give you an idea of what we can expect to see as this ceremony progresses. We understand there's a real focus on the veterans, the words of the veterans. There'll be a look back as to what happened 80 years ago here on D-Day in Normandy, but also we're looking back really through the words of the veterans and their families. So Canadian, American, British, French families really looking at what they have had to say and looking back at their memories of this day. We also know there'll be plenty of music in this ceremony. I spoke a little earlier on to some members of a youth choir who told me that they'll be singing the Chant des Partisans, a very famous song here in France associated with the Resistance. They'll also be singing a very famous song that you will all know the tune to, even if you don't know the name. Very famous song associated with American parachutists. That'll be the Blood on the Riser. That'll be sung as well. And they'll also sing Ode to Joy, which is, of course, the European anthem. So very symbolic choice of songs. We'll also have Emmanuel Macron, the French president. He'll be making a speech. And we know, of course, there'll be an international fly past. So we'll be looking up a little bit later on in the ceremony at the skies to see that international fly past go by. And the ceremony will end also, of course, on the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, which will be sung by the Army Choir, as well as French-Italian singer Léa Desarts.
Claire Paquelin, thanks very much indeed. Well, you were just hearing that from Claire Paquelin, but in fact we're going to play for you a report she produced a short while ago explaining why today is so significant.
D-Day was the largest naval, air and land operation in the history of warfare. It kicked off Allied operations which would liberate Western Europe, defeat Nazi Germany, and end the Second World War. In November 1943, at the Tehran Conference in Iran, Allied leaders Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin decided to organize a vast operation to create a second front in Europe, this time in the West. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the aim was to weaken and eventually defeat Nazi Germany. On the continent, including in France, many people suffering under the Nazis were looking forward to a major Allied operation. The Soviets, too, were paying a heavy price fighting Hitler's troops in the East. A command team, led by the American General Eisenhower, was formed. Normandy was chosen for its long, wide beaches and two deep water ports, Le Havre and Cherbourg. It was also easily in range of fighter aircraft based in Great Britain, and German defences were weaker in Normandy than in the northeast of France. The Allies tried to create an element of surprise by making the Germans think the invasion would take place in the northeast of France or even in Norway. They invented ghost units, used double agents, and spread false information.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
During this time, the real D-Day was being planned in secrecy. On June 6, 1944, an armada of 6,939 vessels crossed the English Channel to Normandy. 11,590 aircraft were in the skies. Within hours, 156,000 Allied soldiers, the majority American, British and Canadian, as well as a handful of French troops, landed by sea and air between the eastern coast of the Cotentin Peninsula and Eastern. The losses were significant, but fewer than feared. 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed or injured on D-Day. It had been expected that 25,000 could be lost. Some 3,000 French civilians were killed during the bombings. D-Day was a success. The Allies broke through Hitler's Atlantic Wall of coastal fortifications and defences. But the road to liberation was still long. D-Day marked the start of the Battle of Normandy, which lasted for 3 months.
Claire Packler for us there. Well, as part of this international commemoration at Omaha today, the Légion d'honneur is to be handed out to a number of American veterans. And Ketavan, look, this is a highly symbolic thing for France to do, and in fact, it happened earlier today with a number of other veterans.
Yes, it is the highest order of merit in France, both military and civilian, and it really recognizes people who have made a very important contribution to France, and what a bigger contribution than fighting to liberate the country. And so, yes, earlier this morning, Emmanuel Macron, during that U.S. ceremony, actually already decorated 11. There were a list of 11 of those veterans who were getting the Légion d'honneur, and he gave those Légion d'honneur and was joined actually by Joe Biden sitting or standing with him and recognizing each and every one of these veterans, all of those who could actually making the effort and wanting to stand up to get that recognition, that medal of the Légion d'honneur. There was a list of 11 names. Emmanuel Macron actually paying tribute to one of the men who he said couldn't make it. Of course, we were talking about the ages of those veterans, and one of them couldn't, in the end, make that trip. But it was a recognition of those veterans, and we're expecting him to do that again during this international ceremony, even though I don't know exactly the number of veterans who are going to be recognized. But it is really a testament of what France recognizes in the debt that they have towards these veterans, recognizing what they did for France.
Ketavan, thank you very much. Let's perhaps just take a moment to listen to some of this ceremony taking place live at Omaha Beach.
Le chant des partisans.
applause there at the end of that iconic French song. Ollie Marks, I believe you know a little about it.
I think it's really interesting that what we're seeing here is perhaps a passing of the torch from generation to generation. You know, we spoke about earlier that idea of memory, of how we recall these events. And while you've got world leaders, you know, at the very pinnacle of their field, we've also got young people for whom this is their exposure to these historical events. And this is their understanding of context. You know, education of these things can take many forms. I understand for many school systems, it's visiting these or other battlefields is an integral part of that, be it this, be it other conflicts. But what's really great here is you've got just that variety of different means of taking this on.
Indeed, let's take another minute there to listen to the music live there at the commemorations at Omaha Beach.
Il est 11h30 le 24 février 1944, lorsque dans le village de Bubry, dans le Morbihan, le père de Ferdinand Mallardet reçoit une lettre de son fils. Sans nouvelles depuis son arrestation quelques mois auparavant à Pontivy pour acte de résistance, reçoit une lettre de son fils.
He understood from the first words
Sans nouvelles depuis son arrestation quelques mois auparavant.
Destiny that had befallen his son. Dear parents, just a couple of words to tell you that I'm to be executed today. Do not lose hope. I would also like you to keep a few memories of me, and that my brother André keep my accordion. As for my clothes, keep them all. Dear parents, I'd like to thank you for the packages you sent me every Friday. I hurt you a lot until I turned 20. And now I'm causing you the greatest pain of all. But please, don't cry for me, because you know for what ideals I am dying. I will not tremble in the face of death. Please don't suffer for me, and be brave. Father, mother, brother, I kiss you all in this last farewell. Dear father, mother, brother, I kiss you all in the final farewell, as well as Aunt Louise and the whole family. Dear father, mother, and brother, Please, be strong, stay brave, because you will be happy after the war. Farewell and good luck.
Depuis 10 000 ans, toutes les guerres ont
For
engendré
10,000
des œuvres
years,
littéraires,
wars
des
have
articles de
given
journaux
rise
ou des
to
lettres de soldats
works of literature,
exhortant
to
à ce qu'elles
articles in
disparaissent.
newspapers
On qualifiait la Première
written
Guerre mondiale
by
au début
soldiers
du
to those they
XXe siècle
decided.
d'ère Dday. La seconde n'a pas échappé à ce désir profond
The Second
que
War
certains
did
êtres,
not
femmes et hommes, ont exprimé avec puissance.
was no exception to ideas
Pour la
that men
plupart,
and
ce
women
n'était pas au
expressed
nom d'un
it was
pacifisme qui leur aurait évité de
in a heartfelt
combattre.
passion.
Au contraire,
We were not
ils pensaient leur
fighting
engagement comme une
for
contribution à la
pacifism, but
disparition des
the people
conflits.
who fought believed that their fight was for that they were fighting for conflicts to
Otis Hewitt,
disappear.
4th Infantry Division, United States of America.
was about the life of President Woodrow Wilson and his lifelong attempt to gain a lasting world peace. Of course, as you know, his efforts were all in vain. But I couldn't help thinking how much different life might have been for the whole world if the plan could have been worked out with the wholehearted support of all the nations. Then there never would have been a World War II, as we call it. And just think how wonderful that would have been. And no other wars either. The whole difficulty seems to be that each new generation must find out for itself how dreadful, costly, and never to see another. I know also that those of us who are fighting in this one hope never to see another. But it may be that there are too many people of all nations who do not actually live, fight, and witness actual combat, and for that reason do not know it in all its horrors. Maybe those who are left when this conflict is over will be able to work out a plan to end it for all time. Let me assure you that all of the men and officers over here that I have talked with are determined to stay in the scrap until it is finished, no matter how long it takes. That is why we came here. It's what we came here to do, and none of us would think of leaving until the job is done.
You're listening there to the French Navy Band playing there live at the commemorations for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, playing the song Entre terre et mer. And as we close that part of the ceremony, good to bring in you, perhaps, Ollie. Just tell us a little bit about what we were listening to and the symbolism of it.
I guess what we saw there was three parts, the three services, Army, Navy and Air Force. French paratroopers from the 11th Parachute Brigade, symbolising the pre-dawn landings of the three airborne divisions, the 6th British, 82nd and 101st US that you might have seen up on the screen in our footage a moment ago, while the French naval band performing Entre terre et mer, symbolising that movement across the channel of the ships, those soldiers who've been cooped up in metal boxes for days before they finally saw the coastline in front of them. And I think shortly we have the aerial flypast to look forward to, beginning tableau number 2.
Indeed, let's keep listening into that ceremony. Thank you very much, Ollie.
The dispatcher came aft with the order, stand up, hook up. Your parachute open. The noise of those 4 engines fading. The plane, your last link with home, disappearing. It is so dark, you cannot see the ground. On the ground in a strange country, I loaded my Sten gun. I could hear shooting and see tracer fire, but it was not coming in my direction. Voice called, Tommy! Tommy! It was a French partisan who led us to the house in Bourg-Neuf. While I was in the house, I met some of the family Robert, including a 5-year-old girl. I offered the chocolate bar from my ration pack, but she would not take it. Should we meet again, I still have chocolate bars, and we'll make the offer again.
Guys.
Most days.
Si ce sont les États-Unis d'Amérique qui ont débarqué à Omaha Beach, 10 autres nations ont participé au débarquement en Normandie, dont le Royaume-Uni, le Canada et la France. Leurs soldats ont, comme tous, ressenti la nécessité d'écrire à leurs proches
Others
afin
before
de
them
témoigner
wrote to their loved
prestement
ones.
en direct de ce qu'ils vivaient.
They were witnesses to what was unfolding before their eyes.
Après cette lettre de soldats français, écoutons celle d'un Américain,
Let us
d'un
hear
Britannique et d'un
from
Canadien.
the letters of a British, American and Canadian soldier.
Captain Donald Dday, 104th Medical Battalion, 29th Infantry Division, United States of America.
Well, I'm in France with the invasion force. Was able to watch the whole show on D-Day from the deck of an LST and then landed with my men on D1. Next afternoon, that is. I'm now living on borrowed time. I'll never forget what I saw and did as long as I live. I'm getting a rapid and thorough education in war wounds and emergency surgery along with other things. This sleeping in a foxhole is now taken as a matter of course, and I'm quite used to all the noises of war. We get the wounded direct from the front by ambulance. What I've seen of France so far I like. My speaking French is very poor, but improving. Have treated some French who are wounded. One little girl, 2 years, was so cute and lovable, just as good as gold. Sat very quietly and didn't move or say a word while I did her dressing. I gave her some candy, which she rapidly and skillfully unwrapped with her little hands and put it in her mouth.
Frederick Gibbons, 152nd Infantry Brigade, 51st Highland Division, Great Britain.
Well, my precious, it's happened as last, as you can see. To say I'm miserable is not true, but to say I'm really glad is far from the case. The few civilians that we have met so far seem in good health and far from undernourished, but that may be because the area is more of an agricultural district. But when we get to some of the bigger towns, it may be a different story. That is far from the case. The few civilians that we have met so far seem in good health and far from undernourished, but that may be because the area is more of an agricultural district. But when we get to some of the bigger towns, it may be a different story. Wouldn't it be grand if that stupid man called Hitler would be sensible enough to pack it in and the whole job be considered over?
No.
Just It seemed a noisy night last evening, but I seemed to sleep.
If you're just joining us on France 24, a reminder of what it is that we are covering for you today. It's a day of special ceremonies dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy, which were on the 6th of June 1944. You're currently watching the international ceremony taking place there. President Emmanuel Macron is there, as well as President Zelensky, President Joe Biden, and Prince William, representing the United Kingdom. Well, joining me in the studio, our veritable team of experts, among them Dday Adamson, who spent quite a bit of time working with the UK Royal Air Force. And I know you wanted to talk to us a bit about the logistics of D-Day leading up to this event and afterwards as well. Just speak to us a bit about what seems particularly pertinent to you.
Sure, thank you. There's a bit of a standing joke that logistics is boring, and that sort of experts sort of should study strategy and not logistics, but it actually should be the other way around. We very much focus on D-Day itself here and the huge effort of arms in order to get that many troops on shore in that time. But of course, they have to be sustained. And at the time, the average American GI would need about 30 pounds, would carry about 30 pounds of kit around with them. The average British soldier would carry about 20 pounds. So on average, once you had the forces on the ground, they would need about 26,000 tons of supplies per day. How do you do that once you've actually secured this bridgehead? Well, one of the things that, if anyone's visited Normandy, they will have seen evidence of, if they've been to Arromanches, is the remains of one of the harbours. And one of the amazing feats of engineering, amongst many feats of engineering, was the construction of 2 complete artificial harbours in the UK. Bearing in mind that there were no deep-water harbours in that part of Normandy. The only one was at Cherbourg, and that was still in German hands until it was liberated by American forces. So in the meantime, to get all this stuff across the Channel and to sustain the guys through the very fierce fighting that followed, they had to build 2 harbours. And if you've been to Arromanches, you'll see those harbours bits of them are still in place, which is a real tribute to the engineering of the time. And 2 were built. One ended up in Arromanches, which is between the UK sector and this sector, and another one also on Omaha Beach. The one at Omaha Beach was destroyed in a storm after about 2 weeks, but they still managed to supply the forces. And this is absolutely critical, as we've seen in contemporary situations in Ukraine. Once you start running out of ammunition, once you start running out of fuel, once you start running out of food, then your attacks begin to grind to a halt. So the ability to actually construct a harbour, and I think we have a photograph of it somewhere, but maybe we could show it later on. To give you an idea, the harbour at Arromanches in 11 days saw 81,000 vehicles unloaded. And to get those 26,000 tons a day to supply what was 800,000 Americans and 600,000 British and Canadian troops in the days after D-Day was a remarkable feat of logistics. And it's the tail end of the spear, if you like, or the shaft of the spear. But without it, that spear soon runs out of steam.
Absolutely, and it is something that is really worth emphasising, isn't it, gentlemen, that we talk about D-Day. It is something many people are aware of, this particular day and the role that it played in history. But the Battle for Normandy went on far longer than that, didn't it?
Absolutely. This is that one significant day, but it's part of a 10-week-long battle within Normandy and 10 months within Northwest Europe. I should just say on the screen at the moment we're seeing the French Army Choir performing Blood on the Risers, a popular marching song of US paratroopers, emphasising perhaps the black humour of soldiers who throw themselves out of planes into battle. But the Battle of Normandy, it is not a single day in history, it is a long moment in which the world is effectively balanced between different visions of what might occur. This was the key event that the Western powers have been building towards for 2 years, but once on the ground, fighting continued for hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides, be it through the Cotentin Peninsula, the Bocage to the west, famed again in the American popular consciousness in popular media, equally to the east, the fighting around Caen for the British and the complex armoured warfare that occurred on that side. Very different dynamics, but nonetheless all leading to a scenario such that by late July, early August, the German military in the west has been stretched to a breaking point. And when, under the command of General Patton, released from 1st US Army Group as discussed, to finally take command on the battlefield, finds himself breaking out of the American bridgehead into the French interior, liberating cities in central France, and ultimately surrounding German forces around Falaise, where notably the 1st Polish Armoured Division, as discussed by Andre, is responsible for sealing the gap. It's a long, complex story. I'm sure I could speak for a lot longer than the bounds of this show about it, but really it's important to consider this whole sweep.
Thank you very much, Ollie Marks, for us there. You just heard their blood
Staline a très tôt
on the
insisté
rises
pour qu'une bataille
as part of this
décisive ait
commemoration.
lieu à l'ouest, au-delà du front méditerranéen, afin de soulager les troupes de l'armée rouge qui menaient des combats sur le front est.
Order to support the Red Army, which was operating on the Eastern Front. And thanks to the Normandy landings, the USSR was able to launch an offensive against the Wehrmacht as early as the 22nd of June 1944. The great poet Anna Akhmatova rendered the pain that the Russian people endured over these years.
Non. Je n'ai pas pleuré toutes mes larmes.
No, I did not
Elles se sont amassées.
cry all my tears out. They accumulated within me. My eyes have none left, not a single tear.
Je vois le monde.
And I see the world.
Plus rien ne m'étouffe.
Nothing stifles me anymore. No kind of torture.
Ou de l'absence.
The only pain is absence.
C'est glissé dans mon sang.
That absence has slipped into my blood. Everything is clear and
J'ai
dry.
l'impression qu'en 44,
And it seems to me that in 1944, and I think it was
Recognising the
first-
role that the Red Army played during the Second World War, while of course not only not honouring but not inviting the leader of Russia today.
Exactly, and that was the distinction that the Élysée Palace insisted that they were going to make during these ceremonies, was to acknowledge and honor the sacrifice and the fight that the Red Army did. And we heard some of what was being said at the ceremony right now. And as you were mentioning, they were instrumental in helping with the situation by having that Eastern Front. And the French really made it clear that this ceremony would not forget what the Red Army had done despite what is happening right now, that they wanted to really set things straight and separate the two. And when it comes to Vladimir Putin saying that the conditions were not met for his presence, but they called the actions of the Red Army a decisive contribution to the ultimate victory and liberation of France and of Europe. And I think that is one of the moments. The question is, will President Macron, in his speech later on during the ceremony, acknowledge that role of the Red Army too?
Indeed, well, we'll see what happens. We'll, of course, bring you Macron's speech live when it gets underway.
Les troupes alliées partaient sur les routes. Libérer la France.
On the routes of France to free the country.
you. We're still with this live ceremony at Omaha Beach in Normandy as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of Dday. And at that ceremony for us is our very own Claire Paquelin. She's with me now. Claire, we're in the midst of the musical tributes to the events 80 years ago. Tell us a little bit about what we've been listening to and your sense of it as somebody who is there.
Certainly, what we've been hearing and watching is basically a look back at the events of D-Day, told through the words of those who lived through it, so largely veterans. We've heard letters that they wrote back to their families being read out, accompanied by music, partly from a youth theatre company or a youth choir, the Maîtrise Populaire of the Opéra Comique. Those are the young people that you've seen on stage. We've also seen music, percussion accompaniment from the French Republican Guard, as well as singing from France's army choir as well. Some of the music that we've heard, Le Chant des Partisans, a very well-known song here in France associated with the French Resistance. We also heard the French Army's choir singing Blood on the Rise. Now that's very much associated with American paratroopers in the Second World War. So certainly the choice of music is extremely poignant here today at Omaha Beach.
Claire Pacquelin, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're now entering the third part of the musical tribute here at Omaha, this third path being called The Path Towards Liberty. That was Ode to Joy you were just listening to there, an anthem of Europe. I'm sure you didn't miss the symbolism, rather. The EU flag there displayed centre stage for a while. Ketavan, what do you make of the fact that this song is being played at the heart of this ceremony?
Well, it is in that segment that is called The Path to Liberty, and it is looking forward to what happened after the end of World War II and how these countries, especially Germany, went from being the enemy to joining the ranks of this European Union that is now represented. And you have the flags of some of the European countries, but also of other countries, other allies. And so the fact that they're playing Ode to Joy, which is the anthem of the European Union, is very significant. To go back to the history of it, it is the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, but he put into music a poem that was written by Friedrich von Schiller, which was from 1785, which talked about the ideal of fraternity for humankind. And that was then taken by first European Council in 1972, and then in 1985, the member states of the European Union decided to make it their official anthem. And so we see this as being the last segment of the ceremony, which is leading to and looking ahead to the results and what came after the destruction of the war, the rebuilding of Europe, and bringing together countries that were enemies into now very strong allies.
Katavan Gorgestani, thank you very much indeed. We're going to hear shortly from Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Before we do, we'll bring you in, Andre. I hope we don't have to interrupt you for this, because I know you do want to talk about the importance of narrative here, the importance that narrative played, particularly after Dday.
Yeah, this has been a remarkable day, and to see these global leaders from Western nations, NATO nations, European nations together in one place is important. And national narratives are important. There is a rather trite comment, I think, that the narrative is always written by the victor. I think in this case, actually, the narrative around this is a very powerful one at a time when the international security situation is as fragile and dangerous as it is. The importance of those alliances, the importance of like-minded nations with shared values coming together and to avoiding the isolation, as President Biden mentioned, I think is really the big takeaway from today's events for me.
Absolutely. Great to have your thoughts. Thank you very much, Andre Adamson, for us there. Ollie Marks, as I say, we are waiting for President Macron to speak. I don't know if there's anything at this stage that you'd like to add.
I mean, a very good summary there of narrative, and perhaps just to close out the narrative of the battle as we move from this recollection onwards. And very much what we're seeing here is the path of Europe, that path towards victory, and it is a path away from the Normandy beaches to the conclusion of this campaign. But fundamentally, it was an incomplete victory. The war continued after August 1944 into May 1945. A great deal more sacrifice was necessary through France, Belgium, Holland, into Germany, elsewhere in Europe and the world. My point being, it's important not just to recall this event, seminal though it is, crucial though it is to our memory, to our modern nation states. It's also important to remember and understand everything else that has happened, so that hopefully we can avoid repeating the events that led us to these beaches in June 1944.
Yeah, absolutely. Ollie Marks, thank you very much indeed. And as I say, we're waiting to hear from the French President Emmanuel Macron at this ceremony in Normandy. And Katavan, look, as I've said, we don't know what the President is going to speak about today, but he carries a political load with him, doesn't he, today? We have European elections coming up on Sunday where Macron is not forecast, his party at least, to do particularly well. We'll have to see what happens. But he may well try to bridge the events of 80 years ago with the path that he sees for Europe today, because he is somebody who believes in Europe, in the European project.
Absolutely. And I think the question is, how subtle or not so subtle will that reference be? But that reference will definitely be there. These European election ongoing in certain countries and culminating on Sunday. And the fact is that the side that is likely to make the most gains during these European elections is the far right, a far right that in many countries is very much if not anti-European, at least Eurosceptic. And so the question is also for Europe, where does Europe go if these powers that are questioning the importance of Europe and the European Union, how what we have seen all day, what we've been talking about all day in these commemorations, how that will hold if those forces come into power. Of course, that's true for the European Union. That's also true for Europe's role when it comes to what is happening in Ukraine, because those same parties are not only Eurosceptic, they're also in some parts. I'm going to let, I think, President Macron speaking.
I just want to express the gratitude of the French people. But three of you had a special relationship, if I may say, with Omaha Beach. And now I will give this Légion d'honneur to three of you before pronouncing the speech. Monsieur Richard Wrong, au nom de la République française, nous vous faisons chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. Monsieur Joseph Miller,
Mr. Joseph Miller,
au nom de la République française,
in the name of the Republic of
nous
France,
vous faisons chevalier
I
de la Légion d'honneur.
hereby knight you Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur.
Monsieur Alistair Brown,
Mr. Alistair Brown,
au nom de la République française,
in the name of the Republic
nous
of
vous faisons
France,
chevalier
I
de la
hereby
Légion d'honneur.
knight you Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur.
Vos Altesses royales, Mesdames et
Your Royal
Messieurs,
Highnesses,
les chefs d'État et de gouvernement,
distinguished heads of states and
Mesdames
government,
et Messieurs, en vos grades et qualités,
distinguished guests,
chers vétérans,
dear veterans,
Mesdames et Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen.
Ici, il y a 80 ans,
80 years ago, on this very day and in this very place,
ont tout défié
these
pour
men
libérer notre sol.
went against all odds to liberate our land and our nation.
Ici, ils ont défié les éléments.
It was here that they defied the elements, the harsh winds, the rain.
Ici, ils ont défié les certitudes.
They went
Hitler affirmait que l'Atlantique était un mur.
and fulfilled their
Lames
destiny.
déchirantes
Hitler
éventaient les barges.
believed
reliées
that
à des explosifs.
the Atlantic was a wall that would protect them. He had laid mines and anti-tank defenses along these beaches. Over 150,000 men were deployed on this marine front. Everywhere there were bunkers and barbed wire and walls that had been erected by Field Marshal Rommel.
La tentative de débarquement sur les plages de Dieppe à l'été 1942.
They had tried to invade and land in Dieppe some while earlier, but it turned into a massacre. They practiced on the beaches of England to prepare for Dday, and an attack by the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had led to the death of over 200 Allied soldiers. And yet they found men and women 80 years ago on this day to join the French fighters overseas and in London, to work hand in hand with the French resistance in France to liberate our country. The Nazi enemy was being spent in the east by fighting the Red Army and was weakening in the west as well, fighting the internal resistance. In 1942, the French resistance fighter René Duchesne, who was working at the commandanture in Caen, managed to steal away the plans, the maps of the fortifications of the Normandy coast between near Honfleur and here. And they were later sent to London. For many months, they prepared decoy tanks and vehicles and sent fake messages to make the Germans believe that the landings would take place in Norway and elsewhere. This was one of the greatest operations in history. An Operation Overlord was prepared in the shadows and under the greatest secret hush. The greatest armada in all history was assembled 80 years ago. On the night from the 5th to the 6th of June 1944, the impossible came to be against daunting odds. Behind us, the dark waters of the English Channel, and facing it, France, sleeping in the long sleep since the defeat it had suffered in 1940. Europe, where democracy had been vanquished by Nazism 4 years earlier, and yet there was still hope thanks to the fight of the French resistance here. Eisenhower gave his orders during the night. Let's go. The bombing started. Over 20,000 paratroopers throw themselves out of 800 planes into the night sky without hesitation, knowing full well that on that day, jumping onto Sainte-Mère-Église was jumping into the pages of history.
Les mâts et les palans des transports de matériel lourd derrière eux glissent vers la France.
Slowly, transport ships are moving towards the French coast, on which men are huddled together, shoulder against shoulder, Many are pale, and one can't tell if the paleness is due to seasickness or because of the letters that they've written into little scribble books in their uniforms, messages for their mothers, fathers, lovers, children. And in front of them, a coast that none of them, or almost none of them, had never seen before, and that will become perhaps the last thing they will ever see. The United States are here. 55,000 American soldiers are making their way to Utah and Omaha Beach. Bloody Omaha. They have crossed an ocean to save a continent that is not theirs for a cause that is. The United Kingdom is here too, with 73,000 soldiers turned towards in the direction of Sword Beach and Gold Beach. And among them, there is Bill Milling, a bagpiper, that holding his instrument in his hand in order to encourage the troops in their assault. Canada is also here with over 20,000 troops directed to Juno Beach. Minute by minute, he sees the thin sliver of beach on the horizon coming closer. The sliver of the continent that they themselves had left or their ancestors had hundreds of years earlier. The first British soldiers would reach Sword Beach under Commander Kiefer. They would be the first, bringing French soldiers to France to be able to touch again their native soil, the soil of their homeland. And I'd like to think of those at Ouistreham and at Saint-Clotilde.
Le ciel est sillonné par des escadrilles pilotées par des Américains,
des
Britanniques, des Canadiens,
skies are crisscrossed by squadrons piloted by French people, Americans, Danes, Greeks, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, among others. 150,000 men land on D-Day, and they do not speak a common language. They do not fight under the same banner or flag, or wear the same uniform. What they share, however, is the will to free Europe from Nazi tyranny, in order to let us live in a free world. It is a certain vision of a man that is worthy and noble, that carries and freedom that they are risking to the peril of their very lives. What they share is also the fright and glory. It is the sands of this beach and the blood that they will spill here. This is their gold, and we spare a thought for them all with great gratitude. To these young men of 17 years or 18 years old, some of them older, who had left their homesteads in Kent or in America to come and fight here, to those who died here under the bullets, those who were killed in the skies before they even touched the ground, to those who survived, to those who are here with us still today, to those who told us about how they threw themselves into the sea with 30-kilo backpacks, to how they braved their fright under the machine gun fire, how they crossed the dunes and climbed the cliffs in order to fight the enemy, moving forward, always and forever. You, have told us about the lives of some of the 10,000 of your brothers in arms who fell that day, their bodies floating on the waters, lapped by the waves. Moving forward, against the odds, in a red tide. Courage is not experiencing fear and ignoring it. Courage is to be afraid, but to go forth nevertheless. That is what the GIs do in their planes, having covered their face in dark coal, ready to jump. Saying it's a long way to go. It's Bill Mullins playing his bagpipes on the ridge here, as the Germans are shocked to see him, afraid to shoot what they consider to be a madman. It's Mr. McGregor, the Canadian sharpshooter, who blew up a bunker and managed to single-handedly capture 93 prisoners of war. It is the chaplain under command of Kiefer who gave the last rites to people dying and breathing their last breaths under the bullets. The American soldiers who climbed the cliff and fought hand to hand using a knife under German fire. All these men were scared. There is no doubt about that. But they knew that the war they were fighting was a just war. They knew that it might lead to their death. But they went forth because each of their steps brought humanity closer to freedom. Our freedom, our liberation, was not something that was won in a day, even if that day was the longest one. It is something that was prepared for many months, for years, by the fighters of the resistance, by the fighters on the Eastern Front, and prepared by the Allies. It took time to win back Europe. It took many sacrifices to do this, sacrifices that one is able to do for love of freedom. The French freedom fighters who disembarked in Italy in 1943 in Corsica, the fighters inside the country who would sabotage infrastructures and disrupt communications, harass German troops. Allied reinforcements who landed in Normandy during the months of July and August, as well as Norwegians, the Piron Brigade made of Luxembourgers and Belgians, wearing a golden line insignia on their chest. The Dutch, under Princess Irene, the second French tank division under General Leclerc, the Polish tank division, that of Czechoslovakia. Then the Allies landed in Provence. Over 250,000 free Frenchmen as well joined them there, together with Pieds Noirs from North Africa, with volunteers from the Maghreb, from West Africa, from Equatorial Africa. Our colonial forces, Moroccan Goumiers, Senegalese tirailleurs, who would together work to open up a new front in the West and the South. We also needed the engagement and relentlessness of the Red Army in the East and the people of the Soviet Empire that did their bit too. These millions of soldiers who sacrificed themselves in order to push back 180 German divisions along the Eastern Front, and paying for this with a tribute of blood, leaving their lives there. by the convergence of all the efforts of all these men, by all these efforts, Cherbourg fell, then Orléans, then Paris, Marseille, Lyon, Metz, Calais, finally Strasbourg at the end of November, and then Germany and Berlin, which led to the capitulation of the Reich in May 1945. And then we had to rebuild our Europe, thanks to peace and friendship among nations, by forgiving and by promising, according to Hannah Arendt's words. Europe has defended democratic values for over 70 years, even though during that time part of Europe was still kidnapped in the central and eastern parts of it. Europe, founded on values that were set in Philadelphia and San Francisco, enabled us to find our way and build friendship and to have a shared ambition with Germany, which is the foundation to our union. We have strengthened ourselves by bringing our countries and our nations together, like the veterans of Dday have shown us the way. We have followed it. And so, dear Chancellor Olaf Scholz, I think also about Johannes Berner, a young German paratrooper, 19 years old, who was on the other side of the beach on D-Day. He was taken prisoner. Later on, he came back and decided to move to Normandy. He applied for French nationality and married Thérèse, a Norman girl. And he became a true European. At Ouistreham, he opened a restaurant, and Johannes Berner met Mr. Gautier, who also fought under Commander Kiefer. A deep friendship was born between these two men who had been enemies before. This is a true metaphor of the reconciliation between our nations. We are all gathered here today, children of the Normandy landings. Those who landed here on the 6th of June were not fighting on their home soil, and they were not fighting for their home villages. They were fighting against an evil, deadly ideology, a culture of hatred that had crushed Jews underfoot, as well as people with disabilities, homosexuals, Freemasons, gypsies, communists, all the people who thought or lived or believed differently. And the silence of our beaches at this moment is filled with the echoes, the sounds of bullets and screams of these men who came from so many different nations. Those who are sleeping under the beaches, under the sands of Normandy, or under the ocean waves, who are buried at the bottom of the seas here, or in the Norman landscape. There are many who also went home but left part of themselves here. So, war is returning to our continent now, and facing this situation, we need to remember everything that these people fought for. Faced with those who are trying to change borders by force of arms and who are trying to rewrite history, we have to be worthy of those who fought for us in this place. Your presence here with us today, Mr. President of Ukraine, says all of this.
Merci. Merci au peuple ukrainien.
I'd like to thank the Ukrainian people for their bravery, for the taste they have of freedom. We are here with you and we will not waver.
Alors oui, quand guette l'anesthésie et l'amnésie.
And so it's true, when threatened with amnesia, when our consciences fall asleep,
c'est cet élan intact qui nous entraîne, sans crainte.
it is this memory that pushes us and makes us fearless. And that is why we are gathered here today, knowing that freedom is a cause that needs to be fought for every single morning. And so, for all people who everywhere on this planet live in hope of living freely, for freedom, equality, and fraternity. For these people, the 6th of June is a struggle that is continuously renewed. Thank you to all of you. Long live the Republic, long live France.
Our coverage of the 80th anniversary of the Dday landings continues. We've just been hearing from the French President Emmanuel Macron speaking at Omaha Beach at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. A great tribute to those who gave their lives, those who survived, and of course the civilian victims of the Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings of June the 6th, 1944. Macron went on to speak also about commitment to the situation in Ukraine, commitment for Ukraine, support for Ukraine. There was a large round of applause for Volodymyr Zelensky, who is in the crowd of special dignitaries there, hearing the President of France speak. He will also, Emmanuel Macron, be giving the Légion d'honneur to certain veterans who are at the scene right now. That's been a pattern throughout the day, that veterans have been honoured for their special sacrifice. Those who survived, of course, have been marked by the experiences they went through on June 6, 1944, when some 160,000 soldiers from the Allies, that's mainly the US, Britain, Canada, but among them 177 French soldiers from the Kiefer Commando landed on the Normandy beaches on this day 80 years ago, and began what many historians say is the beginning of the end of the Second World War. Let's listen now to the French national anthem.
Accents
Choir of the French army with the mezzo-soprano Léa Descendre with that version of the Marseillaise. We're watching President Macron at Omaha Beach, part of the continuing commemorations of the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings. With me in the studio here is Douglas Herbert, but let's try to go live now to our reporter on the scene there at Omaha Beach. Claire Packeland's been following the events of the day. Claire, give us a sense of the atmosphere where you are.
Certainly here at Omaha Beach, we just heard from the French President Emmanuel Macron giving the audience almost a bit of a history lesson, if you like, talking through what happened, the events of D-Day 80 years ago to the day, the Battle of Normandy, the other landings that took place across France, the eventual liberation of France and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany and the end of the Second World War. He was really focusing on who France was grateful to, the men and women who came to liberate France. And he also focused in on how Europe rebuilt itself afterwards. He talked about the strong links between Normans here, so locals here in Normandy, as well as some German soldiers who came back years later, and friendships grew, and he likened that to obviously the very strong relationship that France has now with Germany. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was of course in the audience. We also of course heard the Marseillaise there, the French national anthem, being sung by the French Army Choir, as well as the Franco-Italian singer Léa Descendre. That really is the ending point of this ceremony. Certainly a very symbolic ceremony. You only have to look at the guest list to know that, of course, we have Volodymyr Zelensky in the crowd, the Ukrainian president, and we heard Emmanuel Macron saying to him that we will not waver, we will stand by your side. That, of course, in the context of this ongoing war in Ukraine, that full-scale invasion launched by Russia a little over 2 years ago, the Russian president, of course, Vladimir Putin, not invited to this ceremony. He was at the ceremony, the 70th anniversary and the 60th anniversary, but the Elysee Palace saying that conditions have not been met given the current geopolitical consequences and context in Ukraine. The conditions have not been met to extend an invitation to the Russians for this international ceremony here at Omaha Beach.
Claire Packeland at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, Omaha Beach, one of the places where the American troops debarked on D-Day. Claire, thank you very much indeed. Claire, of course, listening to the speech by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, in which he paid tribute to the veterans, all those who gave so much so we could have our freedom today, but also making that promise to Ukraine that we will not waver, saying that war is returning to Europe and we have to be worthy of those who went before. Emmanuel Macron's words as he was rounding up his speech there at Omaha Beach. With me here in the studio is Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator. Doug, the clear message here, with Volodymyr Zelensky being present at this ceremony, Vladimir Putin, of course, not invited to take part at all, unlike 10 years ago when he was present. Very clear message here for Ukraine and about Ukraine.
Yeah, and some distinctions need to be made in this broader narrative of why Russia isn't there. Why was Vladimir Putin, in some narratives, snubbed, the words being used? France has tried to make it very clear that it is very much cognizant of and grateful for what it calls the decisive Soviet Red Army, not just Russians, but from all the former 15 Soviet republics, the USSR, all of the Red Army troops, their decisive contribution to this war. Let's not forget, it was the Russians, it was Stalin who was literally pleading with the West to open up a second front. It was the Soviets who were enormously frustrated with the West for, as they saw it, delaying, dragging their feet so long, not opening up this second front sooner. So,
in that second front, you mean D-Day, Operation
D-Day,
Overlord,
exactly. The second front. There were two fronts, right? One in the east, the Russians, in which they lost 27 million soldiers.
Because the losses of life on the Soviet side far eclipsed.
I mean,
what we usually talk about.
Eclipsed. So, from the French perspective, they want to make it very clear that the fact Putin is here has nothing to do with the West not recognizing what they say is a decisive Soviet contribution and gratitude for that Soviet contribution. And unlike what a lot of the Russian now, the textbooks, what they're saying there is that kids aren't, they're not being taught in the West, they say. No one mentions the Soviet sacrifice in the West. In fact, there's been much more of an emphasis in schools here in Western Europe on exactly that Soviet sacrifice, not erasing it as the Russians would have it. But it's interesting at the same time because there has been pushback because Russia has become, and some would say by Vladimir Putin's own machinations, Russia has become a pariah. And you can draw a disconnect. You can detach the fact. You could say, on the one hand, the Soviets had a decisive contribution to winning the war and securing freedom for Europe and the rest of the world in World War II, which, by the way, they call the Great Patriotic War, not World War II. And at the same time, you could say, but that doesn't justify inviting Vladimir Putin, who many Russians, not all, but many Russians, do feel, even if they're scared to say it these days, has weaponized this holiday and has tried to draw a direct line between the Soviet fight against the Nazis in Europe and, as he would see it, the fight against the, quote, neo-Nazis in Ukraine right now. And a lot of Russians would tell you that they believe that that is a cynical line which does an injustice to the real memory of the Soviet soldiers, heroic Soviet soldiers who died for the cause, that he is warping, perverting, distorting the historical record in the ambitions, his immediate ambitions for his special military operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine, a future where Russia will once again be in control of those parts of Ukraine it says are its own rightfully.
Indeed, Douglas, you're right to point out that heroism of ordinary Soviet people during that period, and the siege of Stalingrad, for instance, Dday, Volgograd.
The biggest battle of the war.
Absolutely horrendous losses and horrendous sacrifices.
More than in Dday, yes.
Indeed. So in terms of how Russians, ordinary Russians, let's cast Putin and his acolytes to one side. An ordinary Russian person, average man in the street, average
watching
woman in
the
street.
television, reading the paper.
What perception do they have of Dday?
Well, a lot of them, you have to remember, a lot of Russians now are keeping their mouths shut. They're not going to openly express political views. But a significant majority, are also steeped, especially the older Russians, are steeped in the propaganda. And this has become, especially in recent years under Vladimir Putin, the Victory Day and the Dday in the West has been seen as, or promoted as, in the propaganda, Soviet propaganda, but also Russian propaganda today under Putin, as an insignificant, a relatively insignificant event in terms of ending the war. So there's a lot of that. And, that goes, like I said, this goes back to Soviet times. Pravda, which was the official paper of the Soviet Communist Party, Mark, on June 7th, 1944, the morning after the D-Day landings that we just saw Macron speaking about, had a tiny little box on its front page, just a tiny box mentioning the fact, oh yeah, the second front was just open. You had to go way inside the paper for more news about it. And this has been the general optic, the general lens through which Soviets and now Russians have been raised. They see the West as snubbing them, as not recognizing their contribution, as sidelining them, as elbowing them out of the historical narrative. Like I said before, that's factually not the case, and more Westerners are recognizing the Soviet sacrifice. But what they don't want to do, like I said, is give Vladimir Putin the hero's role at the head in this historical narrative right now, at a time when he's waging a war of aggression in Ukraine.
Douglas, thank you. Perhaps it's all the more surprising, given what you said, that Putin was even invited in 2014. We are seeing live from Omaha Beach, Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary. You see the back of Olaf Scholz. On his shoulder is the hand of Joe Biden. There is Joe Biden. And beyond them, Emmanuel Macron. They are discussing, as world leaders do and world figures do, the situation in which they find themselves. And, of course, what they are commemorating is the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings on the very beach behind them. That's one of 5 beaches where the Allied troops landed on June the 6th, 1944. Some 160,000 men landed. Many of them, of course, didn't make it off the beach. But historians look upon this day 80 years ago as the start of the end of the Second World War. We will continue with our coverage after a very short break.
Don't miss Prime News Paris with Thomas Burgess-Watson. Get a better knowledge and understanding of current affairs with our experts and reporters